All right. Welcome back to Rockford Reading Daily. I don't remember what episode this is, which has become a common theme for the introduction for these episodes. However, we are beginning to read a new book today. This episode will be the starting point of us reading Citizens, Cops, and Power, Recognizing the Limits of Community by Steve Herbert. I have not personally read this book before, so this will be my first time reading it. As we did with the previous books, Have Black Lives Ever Matter by Mumia Abu-Jamal and Race Matters by Cornel West. I will read through chapters in this book, and whether at stopping points that are acknowledged within the chapters of the book or at stopping points that I come to myself, we will dissect how the things being mentioned in the piece of literature correlate to issues of police terrorism, mass incarceration, and racial injustice in Rockford, Illinois. I'll sort of just speak about some of the things that I'm taking away from what it is that we're reading in hopes that it forces the listener to contemplate what things they've taken away from what it is that we're reading. So that way we're not just arbitrarily taking in information. So let's start on page 1, introduction. Community tends to be a God word. In many circumstances, when it is mentioned, we are expected to abase ourselves before it rather than attempt to define it. Colin Bell and Howard Newby, Community Studies. Introduction. On a weekday evening, I arrive a few minutes late to a meeting in a church basement in a diverse, crime-ridden neighborhood in southwest Seattle. As I enter, a lieutenant for the Seattle Police Department is reviewing a document his office created recently as part of an application for resources from the federal government's Weed and Seed program. If successful, the application will bring federal monies for both, quote, weeding, end quote, and, quote, seeding, end quote. Resources will be allocated first for intensive law enforcement to arrest and incarcerate known criminals, and second to meet such basic needs as housing, jobs, and education. The theory is that a neighborhood, like a garden, can be restored and replenished, and that serious crime issues can thereby abate. The crowd around the table is not large. Counting the lieutenant, there are 6 local government officials. 7 others work with nonprofit organizations that stand poised to assist in the, quote, seeding, end quote. There are just 6 citizens. The lieutenant makes numerous points during his presentation, but 2 in particular are emphasized. One is that residents should not develop excessively high expectations of the weed and seed operation. In particular, they should expect no more than a 10% reduction in crime. He acknowledges that an earlier version of the document suggested that a 30% reduction in crime was possible, but he dismisses that figure as unrealistic. If the operation were that effective, he says, he would be eligible for a, quote, cabinet-level position, end quote. He says further that even a 10% reduction is ambitious. The second point he stresses is his personal sense of responsibility for the project. He describes it as, quote, my baby, end quote, and tells the audience that they, quote, are in good hands, end quote. After his presentation, the discussion opens. Many express a hope that the police's operations not be heavy-handed. For example, a representative of a youth service organization wants the police to use, quote, weed, end quote, money to fund an officer to work strictly with youth. He argues that this will place emphasis where it belongs, on youth, and would invite something other than a strict law enforcement strategy. His experience leads him to conclude that youth officers are creative in their approach, they find diverse means to help steer youth clear of criminal activities, and they involve themselves deeply in the familial and community context out of which problems spring. Another citizen asks that the police avoid strong-arm tactics. Such tactics, he argues, do little to build trust between the community and the police. Yet another hopes that officers will spend time simply hanging out in the community, getting to know residents better, and building greater trust. Along these lines, one resident suggests that officers patrol not in cars, but on foot or on bicycles. A more impassioned citizen asks, quote, "Do we have clout to do something other than just throwing people away? Are we going to make it positive for kids, or are we just having more meetings?" End quote. The lieutenant acknowledges but does not directly engage this line of discussion. He does say that paying an officer to focus strictly on youth would, quote, strip mine, end quote, his budget, and thus is unfeasible. Other than that specific comment, his responses consist of reassurances. He says that he will take ownership of the weed and seed operation and will hold himself accountable by attending all public meetings. Even though some of them do not know him, he argues, they should take comfort in his competence and willingness to engage. Another focus of the discussion concerns the involvement of citizens in the ongoing oversight of the weed and seed operation. The convener of the meeting works for the local nonprofit The convener of the meeting works for the local nonprofit crime prevention organization that will help oversee weed and seed. She mentions the need for various community groups, such as churches, to become involved, and she expresses a concern that the application document makes the process seem, quote, very professional and very top-down, end quote. She hopes that she and the other professionals involved will be seen as part of the group. She wants the people involved in weed and seed to be responsive to the desires of the citizenry, not vice versa. Quote, let's be totally different, end quote, she says. At no point, however, does anyone propose any means to make, quote, being different, end quote, possible. Indeed, what is most notable is the already low number of citizens in attendance. Of these 6, only 3 actually live in the target area, and all 6 are members of a small group who attend most such meetings. Because I have observed many of those meetings in the months preceding this one, I am on a first-name basis with all of these, quote, regulars, end quote. I talk with some of them after the meeting, and their sense of trepidation is palpable. For months, they have been promised that the weed and seed operation will address their ongoing concerns about crime and other symbols of the area's distress. Now, they are not so sure. Where, they continue to wonder, is the community headed? Okay, and that brings us to a stopping point in Citizens, Cops, and Power, written by Steve Herbert. The first thing that I noticed was the fact that only 6 citizens were attending this meeting that Steve's speaking about here in the beginning, which reminds me of a lot of the meetings that take place here regarding police policy. Most recently, when the body cameras were rolled out by the Rockford Police Department about a month ago, one of the things that happened is they held 3 different meetings around the city of Rockford. One was held at Kitty's Cup in the morning, which is like a coffee spot. Another was held at the other 2 were held at churches in the evening. One on the church on the north side of Rockford, another one on the church on the east side of Rockford. I went to 2 of those 3 meetings. We as an organization, the May 30th Alliance, went to 2 of those 3 meetings. The morning meeting that we went to had about 6 to 7 citizens. It also had multiple police officers there and multiple news outlets that were there and a couple political figures that were there as well. But again, that was the majority of the people. As far as citizens who the meeting should be for, these meetings should not be for the media. These meetings should not be for politicians and policymakers or even members of organization. You know, I'm not including us, the May 30th Alliance, being there because all of those entities are actively doing things to try to get a hold of this type of information, whether it be getting a hold of the information about body cameras, or whether it be, in the case of what we just read, getting a hold of information about the weed and seed program. Organizations are actively doing that. The people who are not in the position to actively do that are members of the community. And often when these meetings are held, just like with the weed and seed and with the body camera meeting that I'm speaking about attending, there is not an extended effort put forth to engage the community that these issues involve to be a part of the meetings. They have the meetings, and here they had the meetings on public display. They put out a message on Twitter and a memo on Facebook saying that they were having the meetings, but there was not a concerted effort to make sure that members of the community came out to the meeting. And that's because these police departments, the city governments, these institutions don't truly have a desire for members of the community to come out to these meetings, to vocalize their concerns in these meetings, to become more informed about how which policies are being implemented, or become more informed about what programs are being implemented. The institution of policing does not operate symbiotically with communities that they police. They operate parasitically with these communities that they police. And the optimum way of operating parasitically with the community is for the community to be uninformed or misinformed about your intentions and your programs and your policies. And so I think that's something that we have to be aware of when we're talking about trying to address and absolve these issues. One of the ways of that is we have to become more involved in things that take place in our communities involving the police institution, involving electoral politics. I don't want to say involving electoral politics, but involving government politics. When there's city council meetings, we have to become more involved being at city council meetings. We have to become more involved being at meetings when police go over new programs or new policies. And it doesn't mean that every person does those things, but we have to start building not organizations. We have to start building bases of people who will do those things, so that way those things can start becoming more normalized actions. Same way a bunch of people go to basketball games and football games. Okay, the God word. As Bell and Newby note, the word sorry about that, y'all. As Bell and Newby note, the word, quote, community, end quote, is indeed a God word in American discourse. The ideal of reasonably cohesive local units capable of self-government has a long history in the United States, promoted by such seminal thinkers as Thomas Jefferson and noted by such early commentators as Alex de Tocqueville. The hope is for residents in particular localities to gather as a political entity, to know together the problems that they must confront, and to decide how to ameliorate them. In this way, citizens learn more about themselves and each other and experience the unique sense of political effectiveness that comes through communal action. Through this political work, isolated individuals can create an efficacious collective and can control themselves with minimal outside help. In Michael Sandel's words, quote, when politics goes well, we can know a good in common that we cannot know alone. The notion of community is often central to these visions of decentralized politics, and its salience continues into the present day. In fact, it has received a considerable boost in recent years through a movement loosely defined as communitarianism. One thrust of this movement is in political theory, where thinkers like Michael Sandel, Alistair McIntyre, Charles Taylor, and others seek to challenge the hegemonic positions of liberalism, which they believe overemphasizes the rights-bearing individual. Another thrust of this is more overtly political, which public intellectuals like Amitay Etzioni and Don Eberle arguing for the need to restore the moral fabric in American society through the reinforcement of communally held values. Yet there is a significant variance. Marked variations in West Seattle's topography produce corresponding variations in real estate pricing. High-value property is found along the beach or on high bluffs with scenic views. Lower values are found in the valleys and in the flatlands to the south. To capture this variation, I choose 3 contagious yet diverse police beats. One of these, which I call, quote, beachland, end quote, lies along the western edge of West Seattle. It includes homes with median incomes well above the Seattle average. The vast majority of these homes are owner-occupied. The population is also about 90% white. Not surprisingly, its rates of reported crime are low, as are the number of calls for police service. The second area, quote, Midlands, end quote, is significantly more diverse. Located in the center of the peninsula, this area possesses many upper middle income residents living in owner-occupied homes in areas that are predominantly white. But it also includes a large public housing project, quote, Blufftop, end quote, whose residents are poor and ethnically diverse. The facility, quote, the facility composed of small, detached units sprawls across several acres stitched together by a meandering street pattern. It generates a steady flow of calls for police service, in part because of a long history of outdoor drug sales on the grounds. The overall crime pattern for Midlands, measured by arrest, places it well above the average for Seattle. As measured by arrest, places it well above the average for Seattle. It has particularly high numbers of reports of burglary, auto theft, domestic assault, and narcotics. Police officers attribute these high numbers in Midlands to the presence of Blufftop. The third area, quote, Flatlands, end quote, also has a high crime rate, and it generates the highest number of calls for service of any SPD beat. It has high numbers of reports of arson, auto theft, burglaries, domestic assaults, homicide, and narcotics. The demographic pattern is mixed, with two largely middle-class neighborhoods, which I call, quote, West Side, end quote, and, quote, East Side, end quote, bracketing a more diverse and poorer neighborhood, quote, Centralia, end quote. The former two posses significantly more owner-occupied homes and are majority white. By contrast, Centralia's homes are 45% owner-occupied, and the white population only barely exceeds 50%. African Americans, Asians, and Latinos each account for about 15% of the population, with American Indians providing for the bulk of the rest. Damn, I didn't even know people still said Indian. Okay. This demographic variance within a tight-knit urban locale maybe he means different. He say American. My fault. That's a stream of consciousness. It's my fault, y'all. Let's get back. The demographic variance within a tight-knit urban locale offers an unusual opportunity to unearth the range of factors that might either prohibit or promote both effective communal governance and productive community police interactions. I explore these dynamics through the use of three sets of qualitative data. The first comes from extensive semi-structured interviews with 46 residents in the 3 police beats, conducted primarily by a trained research assistant. These interviews enabled residents to discuss, quote, community, end quote, at some length, what the term meant to them, whether their neighborhood warranted the label, what they hoped from community, what they sought to contribute to it, what role it could play in neighborhood betterment. The interviews also compel residents to describe what problems, if any, their neighborhood faced and the role they envisioned for the state in resolving these problems. In this vein, they were asked specifically to discuss problems of crime and disorder and to articulate their vision of the role of police. Residents also assessed the police's actual practices. The interviews covered a schedule of questions, but they were conducted in a loose and improvised fashion to give residents the conversational freedom to expand upon particular issues. The interviews typically lasted more than an hour and generated transcripts that averaged 13 single-space pages. The population of interviewees was diverse. Half had lived in their homes for 7 years or longer, half for less. The largest group, 18, were in their 40s. 14 were younger, including 7 in their teens, and 14 were older. 42% earned less than $35,000 a year, 26% earned between $35,000 and $65,000, and 14% earned more than $65,000. 18% declined to provide income information. 26 of the interviewees, 56%, were white. 10, 22% were African American or African. 3, 6.5% were Latino. 3, 6.5% were Asian. And 4, 9% were American Indian. There was oversampling in 2 categories. All but 7 of the interviewees came from either Midlands or Flatlands. Because his crime pattern was minimal, Beachlands was a less instructive place to discern patterns of communal governance and of police-citizen interaction. Indeed, none of the Beachland residents had any serious concerns about crime, and all of them reported minimal contact with the police. By contrast, many Midlands and Flatlands residents reported considerable concern about crime and regular interaction with police officers. These neighborhoods provided greater opportunities to assess the promise of community policing. Anti-crime activists were the second oversampled group. About 1/3 of the interviewees described a high level of past or present involvement in collective attempts to reduce crime. Such involvement positioned these respondents to assess the challenges and potential for productive communal efforts to work with the police to reduce crime. The second set of data consists of field notes gathered during ride-alongs and interviews with members of the Seattle Police Department. The 23 ride-alongs were with 3 groups of officers with responsibility for one of the 3 beats. 13 were with patrol officers who are, quote, first responders, end quote, to calls for service and who regularly cruise the streets. 5 were with sergeants who supervise patrol officers, often in the field. And 5 were with members of the, quote, community police team, end quote. These officers are the principal public face of community policing in Seattle. Their main tasks are, quote, 1, to attend public meetings to provide information and solicit input, and 2, to monitor areas of ongoing concern, such as a home or street corner suspected of hosting drug trafficking. The ride-alongs were an opportunity to learn how officers conceive of, quote, community, end quote, and to witness how those conceptions shaped officers' approaches to the citizenry. Besides these ride-alongs, I conducted interviews with 3 lieutenants and 2 captains. The lieutenants were each responsible for some portion of the community police operation, and the captains headed the precinct that included the study police beats. The third set of data was collected at 29 meetings that brought together police representatives and citizens. Most of these were regularly scheduled gatherings of neighborhood organizations or anti-crime groups, although some, such as the weed and seed meetings described above, were one-time special meetings. These meetings offered a chance to learn what, quote, community, end quote, means in practice, how it is that police and other government agents do and do not work together to confront problems of crime and disorder. Together, these data enable an opportunity to assess the political weight community can support in projects like community policing. Residents assess community and its potential for political action. Police officers describe how they like best to articulate with citizens. Public gatherings show, quote, partnerships, end quote, in action. Brought together in the same analytic project, these data can make plain the possibilities and pitfalls of seeking communal political regeneration through a project like community policing. That brings us to another stopping point here. I want to see what our time is at. Give me 1 second. Okay, we got 23 minutes, 40 seconds. I'm not sure how long this chapter is. I think we maybe can get through the whole chapter. I don't want to make this more than 40 minutes. I really don't want to make it more than 35 minutes. So in that segment, I think one of the things I get from that passage there is the importance actually of going into the field and conducting these type of analyses. Going into the field, and this needs to happen in multiple cities. The same thing he's speaking about doing in Seattle, needs to happen in Rockford and Belvedere and Rochelle and Rockton and Chicago and Peoria. We need people with boots on the ground analyzing what members of the community are experiencing when dealing with these police officers, what different, not even just members of the community, because he's going into trying to figure out if people even feel like they are a part of a community. But we need to know what everyday people, what their experiences are like with police departments in their city, what their worries are about their neighborhoods in their city. And I think that once we start getting to that point of everyday people's stories being put at the forefront of the issues of police terrorism, mass incarceration, and racial injustice, we do the first steps of adequately addressing these things, so that way we can begin to absolve them. I think too often there's these talking points about the issues of police and the issues of mass incarceration and the issues of racial injustice are concocted by news media outlets, or are concocted by social media headlines, and are not driven enough by what everyday people are experiencing. And so I think that's the main thing that I take away from that passage there, is the importance of having these type of experiments being done in every city around this country. Here, let's keep on reading. On qualitative case study research. It is important to stress that my goal is not to evaluate community policing for its, quote, success, end quote, which is usually measured in terms of its effects on crime and fear of crime. I seek instead to outline the normative assumptions that legitimate community policing, and to assess these against the assumptions that residents and police officers employ in understanding themselves and each other. My interest, ultimately, is the capacity for community policing to enable neighborhoods to generate localized democratic action and to garner the attention of the state. This explains my use of qualitative data. Research that focuses on what, quote, works, end quote, inevitably takes a strong quantitative tack, because it seeks to measure the impacts of police practice on some outcome, such as crime or fear of crime. My decision to foreground normative questions and to assess their tractability on the grounds leads me down a different methodological path. The qualitative data I marshal here are the only appropriate choice for the questions I address. Only these data can enable an exploration of what community means to those who are to create and enact it, and of the processes through which it is or it is not enacted. One potential downside here, of course, is that I am confined to a single case study at a single point in time. One might then question my capacity to generalize the lessons of my analysis to other locales. 2 points lessen considerably the bite of this line of critique. One is that the general finding I describe here of minimal productive, end quote, partnerships, end quote, between cops and citizens is not uncommon in other locales. Indeed, it appears to be the norm. Given that urban police departments in the United States face similar challenges and develop similar organizational profiles, there is every reason to believe that the widespread failure to create stronger partnerships derives from similar causes. What I offer here is an explanation for why this reality is so commonplace across locales. Other places may well differ in some respects from Seattle, but there are strong reasons to believe that the impediments I outline recur elsewhere. Secondly, West Seattle is a place where community policing might be expected to take root. If it cannot succeed there, then perhaps there are inherent problems with community policing that warrant the considered attention I provide. Seattle is therefore an ideal test case. One particular advantage of qualitative data is that it enables social meanings and processes to be rendered understandable through the actual words of residents and the actual practices of important actors like the police. In the analysis that follows, I make considerable use of such data to illustrate my arguments as vividly as possible. To use data in this way, however, raises a legitimate concern about the representativeness of any particular quotation or incident. Although I did no statistical analysis to address this representativeness of resident comments or police behavior, I only used data to illustrate perspectives or patterns that were evident across multiple interviews or observations. An additional issue to address at the outset is the use of the term, quote, community, end quote. In this analysis, a point to which I now return. Okay, and I think we will end this episode on that note there, on that point there. And this last passage, again, is just sort of diving into some of the case study research and some of the critique that the case study research may receive. And the thing that sticks out to me the most about what he notes there about Seattle is that I think that there are multiple cities like he's saying Seattle is, where they are a microcosm for the country, and that you can sort of take the temperature of the country as a whole based on the temperatures in these different cities. And so to hear him speak about that, he thinks Seattle is one of the places where the issues that he believes Seattle is one of the places where the issues that are taking place there can be seen also manifesting in other places, so that this research, even though it is isolated to Seattle and does not include Chicago or Oakland or Atlanta or Birmingham or Rockford, you can still learn things about all of these places through the research that he's doing in Seattle because of the commonality of these issues in all these other places. He also speaks about how how Seattle is the place where community policing should work, and if community policing is not working here, then it's implications that it won't work anywhere. And so to try to transfer that over to some of the things about Rockford, I have regularly said that Rockford is a microcosm for the issues that affect America as a whole, specifically the issues of police terrorism, mass incarceration, and racial injustice. The city of Rockford is a city that profits from its citizens being ushered in and out of the county jail. The city of Rockford is a city that has historically miseducated communities of color and citizens of color and communities, impoverished communities and working class communities. I don't know how many people know about the lawsuit. It's a lawsuit, the People Who Cares versus the RPS 205 school district, in which the school district was said to have maybe the most segregated school system in American history, was said to have racism down to a science. And so I bring up all of those things to say that one of the overall themes of our country is the miseducation of poor people and working class people, is the miseducation of people of color, and how that miseducation perpetuates crime, and how that miseducation perpetuates violence, and how that miseducation perpetuates the negative parts of our society. And so I believe that you can study the miseducation that has taken place in Rockford and learn about the miseducation of this nation. I believe also that this city is it's factual that this county, averages twice a year either an in-custody death or a police shooting. Twice a year since 1990. Over 50 cases since 1990 have taken place here. And so you can also learn a lot about the what up? You can also learn a lot about the type of violence that is in the institution of policing, the type of inhumaneness that exists in the institution of policing, by studying how often that violence and inhumaneness manifests itself here in Rockford. And then you can also learn about the process of the process of impunity, the process of the culture of impunity that exists in the institution of policing in this city, by not just in this city but in this nation, by studying what happens after these acts of violence are perpetuated by police, studying how police officers get put on administrative leave here, the same way they do all over the nation. They get paid leave to shoot citizens, how the person who is killed by the police is criminalized. The police officer victimizes them, and then the police department uses the media and uses propaganda to victimize and dehumanize and criminalize the person who the individual officer has victimized. And so that gets you into learning about the institutional problems as well of policing. And as you study as we have studied here, the things that have happened in Rockford, it informs you about the same things that are going on in Atlanta and Chicago and in Oakland. So that way you can use one city as a case study, but you can take the information that you learned in that city and you can apply it to your city and educate yourself about your personal city or your personal county or your personal area. So those are the things that I take away from this first passage of Citizens, Cops, and Power. We'll be back tomorrow with another episode of Rockford Reading Daily, continuing on in this book. I want to ask you to please share this on whatever platform you're listening to it on. If you have not listened to previous episodes of Rockford Reading Daily, please go back and listen to the previous episodes. The first book we read was Have Black Lives Ever Matter by Mami Abu-Jamal. The second book we read was Race Matters by Cornel West. And here we are now reading Citizens, Cops, and Power, Recognizing the Limits of Community by Steve Herbert. All right, we outside.